It begins in the smallest of moments. A conversation over coffee where you're only half listening. A friend speaks, their words drift like soft echoes, yet inside, you're already preparing your reply. You nod, you smile, but the truth is, you're not really there. We live in a world obsessed with speaking, with expressing, sharing, performing. Every thought must be posted, every silence must be filled. We speak not just to be heard, but to exist. And yet, there is another kind of intelligence, one that doesn't rush to answer, one that listens so deeply, it dissolves the need to respond at all. Because when you listen, truly listen, something extraordinary happens. The walls between self and world begin to thin. Your mind stops rehearsing and starts receiving. And suddenly, what you hear is not just the voice of another person, but the quiet murmur of life itself, whispering beneath the noise. In that stillness, understanding is born. Not from clever words, but from presence. Not from control, but surrender. The question is, in a world that rewards the loudest voice, how do we rediscover the wisdom of listening? And what might we hear if we finally stopped trying to speak? We have never been so connected, and yet so unheard. Our words travel faster than light, bouncing through screens, satellites, and servers, reaching millions in seconds. But beneath this dazzling network of voices lies a quiet emptiness. Everywhere people are talking, on podcasts, in comments, in endless threads of digital noise. We pour our thoughts into the world, hoping someone will listen. But the paradox of our time is this: the more we speak, the less we're truly understood. We confuse communication with connection. We mistake replies for empathy. We call it sharing, but often it's just an echo chamber of our own beliefs, each person shouting into a canyon, waiting for their own voice to return. In ancient times, wisdom was passed not through shouting, but through listening. The student sat in silence beside the teacher, not to argue, but to absorb. Now the student interrupts before the sentence ends, scrolling, swiping, defending, reacting. We have replaced understanding with opinion, reflection with response. And it's not only online. Even in real life, we rarely listen to hear. We listen to answer. We finish each other's sentences not out of empathy, but impatience. We nod, but our minds are already miles ahead, crafting our next sentence, our next defense, our next performance. It's no wonder conversations feel so empty. They're not exchanges, they're parallel monologues. And yet, deep within us, something aches for silence. A voice beneath the voices, a space that doesn't demand to be filled. Because the truth is, silence scares us. To listen fully is to risk being changed. It means surrendering the comfort of knowing. It means admitting that the other might be right. And that's terrifying in a world built on certainty and self-expression. But maybe this is where the real paradox hides. In our obsession with being understood, we've forgotten how to understand. In our need to be seen, we've stopped seeing others. And in our endless desire to speak, we've lost the ability to hear. You can feel this tension everywhere, in relationships that dissolve under the weight of misunderstanding, in societies divided not by truth, but by the inability to listen. The noise grows louder, And yet the signal, the soul, grows faint. Sometimes you wonder, if everyone is talking, who's left to listen? And perhaps that's the quiet rebellion we've been missing. Not the courage to speak louder, but the courage to be still. Because to listen deeply, fully, is to open a door into the unknown. And in that unknown, we might just rediscover what it means to be human. But what if listening isn't just a social skill, but a spiritual act? There is a kind of listening that has nothing to do with the ears. It happens not in the mind, but in the space between thoughts. A stillness so pure that even sound seems unnecessary. True listening is not about waiting for your turn to speak. It is not about analyzing or interpreting. It is not about finding the right answer. It is about disappearing. When you truly listen, the you who wants to control, to explain, to impress, quietly fades, and what remains is awareness itself, naked, attentive, unguarded. It doesn't judge. It doesn't prepare a response. It simply receives. The great teachers of every tradition spoke of this. The Buddha called it right listening, the art of hearing without the filter of ego. Lao Tzu hinted at it when he said, "Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know." Even Socrates, the voice of reason, began every dialogue not with an answer, but with a question. Because real wisdom doesn't begin with knowledge, it begins with wonder. To listen is to surrender the self that always wants to be right, and that surrender is frightening because it feels like death. But in that small death of the ego, something astonishing occurs. Life begins to speak back. The world starts to reveal its subtle harmonies. The wind through the trees becomes a kind of teaching. The silence between two heartbeats becomes a message. The eyes of another person become a mirror. You begin to hear not with your ears, but with your being. This is why silence has always been sacred. It isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of depth. When you fall silent inside, the universe no longer feels like something happening to you. It becomes something happening through you. But modern life trains us in the opposite direction. We are conditioned to interrupt, to fix, to prove, to perform. We treat listening as passive, when in truth it is one of the most powerful acts of awareness. It transforms not only how we relate to others, but how we relate to existence itself. Consider this. The sun doesn't shout to be seen. The ocean doesn't argue with the shore. The stars don't compete for brightness. They simply are. And in their silent being, they communicate everything. When we learn to listen like that, we begin to live like that. And something begins to soften. You stop needing to win the conversation. You stop fearing silence. You stop searching for validation because you found something deeper than approval. Presence. Presence is the soil in which wisdom grows. You don't need to force it, just as you don't force a flower to bloom. You simply clear the noise, the mental chatter, the opinions, the urgency to respond. And what's essential emerges on its own. This is why listening can heal. When someone is truly heard, they rediscover their wholeness. They no longer need to defend their pain, because their pain has finally been witnessed. It's as if the simple act of listening whispers, you are safe to exist as you are. How rare that is, and how desperately the world hungers for it. In therapy rooms, in classrooms, in marriages, in politics, we keep talking at each other when all we really want is to be felt, to be known without being corrected. The one who listens becomes a mirror, reflecting others not as they pretend to be, but as they truly are. To listen deeply, then, is to love, because love itself is a form of listening, a silence that welcomes whatever arises without resistance or agenda. The sages knew this. That's why they retreated into mountains, sat by rivers, and waited, not for answers, but for the silence between them. They understood that truth cannot be spoken into existence. It can only be heard by an unguarded heart. Imagine what would happen if we lived like that again. If parents listened to their children without projecting their fears. If lovers listened not to defend, but to understand. If leaders listened not to respond, but to serve. If humanity, for one still moment, simply listened, perhaps the noise of conflict would collapse under its own exhaustion. Because listening, at its highest level, is unity. It's the realization that there is no you and me, only the dance of awareness echoing between two mirrors of consciousness. When you listen without self, you become the space in which everything is heard. And in that space, everything is already whole. It sounds poetic, maybe even mystical, but it's profoundly practical. The next time you're in conversation, notice how quickly your mind leaps forward, racing to fill the silence. Then pause. Feel that tension, and instead of responding, listen more deeply. In that pause, something sacred begins to open, a small gap where the world can breathe through you. And you realize that listening is not an act you do, it's a state you allow. It is the practice of emptying yourself so completely that life can finally speak in its own voice. And maybe that's the ultimate truth. You don't learn by listening to others. You learn by becoming the listening itself. Sometimes the deepest answers arrive not in words, but in silence. There once was a young monk named Arun who lived in a monastery nestled among the mountains. He had come seeking enlightenment, the great silence his master always spoke of. But all he found within himself was noise. Every morning, he sat cross-legged before the golden statue of the Buddha, and every morning his mind screamed louder than the bells that called the monks to prayer. Thoughts raced, old memories returned, arguments he had never finished replayed endlessly. He was listening for divine truth, but all he could hear was himself. One day, exhausted and ashamed, Arun approached his master, an old monk named Tenzin, whose eyes carried both thunder and peace. "Master," Arun said, bowing low, "I cannot hear the silence you speak of. No matter how hard I try, my mind will not quiet. What must I do?" Tenzin smiled. "Go down to the valley," he said softly, "and listen to the river until you can hear it." Confused, Arun obeyed. He walked down the mountain, sat by the rushing water, and listened. At first, the sound of the river was overwhelming, a wild chorus of movement. He tried to focus, but his mind kept wandering. What lesson is hidden here? What am I supposed to hear? He sat there for hours, but nothing changed. He returned to the monastery feeling defeated. The next day, Tenzin asked, "What did you hear?" "Only noise, master," Arun replied. "The water is too loud." Tenzin nodded. then listen again tomorrow. For 7 days, Arun returned to the river. Each time he tried to listen harder, straining, focusing, analyzing, until his body ached from effort. And each evening, when the sun dipped behind the cliffs, he would return no wiser, no closer to silence. On the 8th day, something in him broke. He sat by the river and wept. All his knowledge, his meditation techniques, his spiritual pride, they suddenly felt empty, useless. He stopped trying. He simply sat. And in that surrender, something subtle began to shift. The sound of the river no longer felt like noise. It became a rhythm, ancient, patient, alive. He began to hear not the water, but the space around it, the pauses between ripples, the breath between the wind and the waves. For the first time, he wasn't listening to the river. He was listening with it. Hours passed unnoticed. When the moon rose, the river shimmered like liquid glass, and in that stillness, Arun felt the world exhale through him. The silence his master had spoken of was not the absence of sound. It was the quiet within the listening itself. The next morning, Arun returned to Tenzin. The master looked into his eyes and asked, "What did you hear?" Arun smiled gently. "Everything." Tenzin nodded. "And nothing?" "Yes," Arun whispered. "Everything and nothing." The old monk laughed, his voice echoing softly through the hall. "Then the river has finally spoken." That night, as the bells rang for evening meditation, Arun sat once again before the Buddha. But this time he did not try to silence his mind. He simply listened. To the breathing of his brothers, to the flicker of candles, to the pulse of his own heart. He realized that the silence was never something to reach. It was something to remember, because the truth was never hidden. It was always there, whispering beneath the current of his thoughts, waiting for him to stop speaking long enough to hear it. And in that moment, Arun understood what his master had meant all along. The river does not teach through words. It teaches through presence. And when you finally learn to listen without searching, the whole world becomes your teacher. Sometimes the sound you've been seeking is already flowing through you. There comes a moment in every life when words stop working. When the things you thought you knew, the labels, the philosophies, the defenses, all dissolve in a quiet you can't escape. Maybe it happens in grief, when someone you love is gone and every sentence you try to form feels too small for the emptiness they left behind. Maybe it happens in awe, when you stand before a sunset so vast that all language collapses into silence. Or maybe it happens in love, when you look into another person's eyes and realize that no explanation could ever describe what passes between you. That's when you understand. Silence isn't emptiness. It's truth in its purest form. Because everything we chase, belonging, peace, meaning, it all hides beneath the noise of our explanations. And when the noise stops, what remains isn't loss, it's clarity. We live surrounded by voices, advice, opinions, warnings, projections. And in the chaos, we lose the sound of our own soul. We keep shouting, thinking the world will hear us, when all along it was we who needed to listen. Listening, real listening, doesn't just connect us to others, it reconnects us to ourselves. It reminds us that beneath our fears, beneath our roles, beneath our noise, we are simply awareness, vast, receptive, unbroken. Think about the last time someone truly listened to you. Not out of politeness, not to reply, but because they wanted to understand. Remember how it felt, how your heart softened, how your guard lowered. That's what happens when silence meets silence. It's not two people exchanging words. It's two beings remembering they were never separate. This is why the world is starving for stillness. Not the stillness of absence, but the stillness of attention, the kind that says, "You matter enough for me to be fully here." When we listen like that, healing happens without effort. Conflicts dissolve without winners. Love begins to speak in its first language, presence. In the end, the greatest act of compassion isn't what you say, but what you allow. It's the space you create for another person to unfold, unedited, unjudged, unhurried. That is the deepest listening of all, the kind that transforms not just relationships, but reality itself. Because when we stop trying to speak over life, life finally speaks through us. And maybe that's what the great masters meant when they spoke of awakening. Not a grand revelation, but the simple return to the silence that was always there. A silence that listens. A silence that loves. A silence that is. And in that silence, we finally remember. The world was never asking us to be louder. It was asking us to be still enough. To hear. Sometimes the soul doesn't want answers. It just wants to be heard. So much of life is spent trying to be understood, to be seen, validated, approved. But what if the real peace we're looking for isn't found in being heard, but in learning to listen? Not with effort, not with technique, but with presence. The kind that requires nothing, demands nothing, defends nothing. The next time someone speaks to you, let the silence do the work. Don't fill it, don't fix it. Let it breathe between you like open sky. You may discover that what they truly needed was not your wisdom, but your stillness. And when you're alone, turn that same attention inward. Listen to your thoughts without resistance. Listen to your emotions without judgment. Listen to the life quietly unfolding inside you. Because even there, in the chaos of your own mind, something sacred is whispering. It says, you don't need to know. You just need to hear. That is the beginning of peace. Not when the noise stops, but when you stop fighting it. So today, don't rush to speak. Don't rush to fill the silence. Just listen. Because when you listen deeply enough, you'll realize it was never the world trying to reach you. It was life itself, waiting for you to be quiet long enough to understand. And in that stillness, you are finally home. When you listen deeply, silence becomes a language, and love becomes the reply.